You know, when I was going through the stuff you sent over, the whole cousin marriage thing in Pakistan really jumped out at me. Like, it's one thing to hear about it in passing, but when you realize just how common it is there, apparently we're talking like 50 to 60% of marriages.
It's really quite prevalent.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around, at least from where I'm sitting. You know, culturally speaking, it's just not something you see.
Right. It's definitely more familiar in certain parts of the world than others. I mean, the term cousin marriage or consanguineous marriage, if we're being formal, it's not like Pakistan invented it.
Yeah.
Historically, tons of cultures have practiced it.
Oh, for sure.
Mughals, for instance, who ruled over India for ages, it was pretty standard for them.
Yeah, right. And it wasn't just them. The source audio mentioned a bunch of other royal families throughout history who are all about that cousin marriage life. Makes you wonder if it was as much about strategy as anything else, you know? Keeping the power within the family and all that.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head there. If you think about the historical context, it wasn't always just lovey-dovey, right? Marriages, especially among the, well, let's call them the upper crust, often revolved around solidifying power, making sure the bloodline stayed pure, basically guaranteeing the dynasty continued on and on. And honestly, in a way, it makes a weird kind of sense in those times. When alliances could change overnight, you wanted that bedrock of stability, of knowing who you were dealing with.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. It's like that desire for stability, that knowing what you're getting into, maybe that feeds into the whole thing even today. Because like the source audio mentioned how in Pakistan there's this whole familiarity thing. Families already know each other, so there's less of a gamble. I mean, I'm not saying it's right or wrong or anything, but is that really so different from how arranged marriages work in a lot of ways?
You got a point there.
Like, aren't those also kind of based on this idea of vetting, of making sure everyone's on the same page?
You know, that's an interesting way to look at it, and it gets at something fundamental about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it speaks to how deep some of these traditions run, you know?
Absolutely.
But there's this whole other side to this that we got to dig into, and it's the one that always seems to get people riled up, the science of it all.
Right, and it's tricky, right, because you want to be sensitive, not like we're here to point fingers. It's more about understanding.
100%.
So, okay, just from like a pure science perspective, what are we talking about when we compare cousin marriage to, say, two people from totally different families having kids? I think it all comes down to genes.
It really does. So, in the simplest terms, when you have two people who are closely related, the chances of certain genetic traits getting passed down, it goes up.
Okay.
And I'm not just talking about your grandma's nose or whatever. I'm talking about the potential for some serious genetic disorders, things that can have a real impact.
Right. So walk me through that. Why is the risk of those disorders higher when we're talking about cousins marrying?
So here's the thing. We all carry 2 copies of most of our genes, one from mom, one from dad. And sometimes we inherit a gene that has the potential to cause a problem, but a lot of times these are what we call recessive genes.
Recessive genes. So they're like less likely to actually cause an issue?
In a way, yeah. A recessive gene, it only really rears its head if you happen to get 2 copies of it, one from each parent.
Okay.
But here's where cousin marriage comes in. Because there's a bigger overlap in the DNA that's getting passed around, the chances of both parents carrying that same recessive gene, it shoots way up.
I see. So it's like the closer the family ties, the higher the statistical probability that those recessive genes are going to find each other and, well, express themselves, so to speak, in any kids the couple might have.
Exactly. And look, it's not a sure thing. It's not like every kid is going to have a problem, but it definitely increases the odds.
Right. Makes sense. And the source audio actually mentioned a couple of specific examples of disorders that are more common in these situations. Thalassemia and sickle cell anemia. And those aren't like minor things either. They're serious conditions that can really impact someone's whole life.
Absolutely. And if I remember correctly, those specific conditions are fairly widespread in Pakistan, aren't they?
Yeah, they are, which is, I mean, that can't be a coincidence, right?
It's not. In fact, a huge chunk of children born with those conditions in Pakistan, we're talking a significant majority, come from consanguineous marriages.
Wow. Do you remember the exact percentage?
I think it was something like 80%, which is just wild when you really think about it.
80%, that's huge.
It is. And, you know, it highlights how complicated this whole thing is, right? You've got deep-seated cultural practices bumping up against what science is telling us. It goes way beyond individual families at that point. It starts to impact public health, social systems. It's a lot.
It's like, I don't know if pandemic is the right word because it's obviously not contagious, but it's got that same kind of ripple effect, you know? like a silent pandemic or something.
It really does.
And we're not even talking about like a quick fix here. These conditions often require care for someone's entire life, special treatments. It puts a huge strain on families, emotionally, financially.
You're right. You can't separate the human cost from the science, and that's where things get really dressed.
It really makes you think about how you even start to address something like this, especially when we're talking about traditions that are so deeply rooted. I mean, marriage is personal.
You're right. It's not as simple as just telling people to, like, stop it.
Right.
These traditions are woven into the fabric of these communities. They go back centuries, and they're tied up with such strong beliefs about family, about kinship, about what holds a society together. You know?
Totally. And it's not like people are completely in the dark about the health stuff either. The source material mentioned there are definitely efforts happening within Pakistan to make people more aware of the risks.
There are, for sure, and genetic testing is becoming more common, which is a good thing. Although,
Yeah, it seems like it's still catching on kind of slowly.
it is a slow process.
Which I guess makes sense. You're fighting against centuries of tradition here. It's bound to be a gradual shift. So where do you even go from here? How do you respect those values, that history, while also like looking out for future generations?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't think there's one easy answer. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach, so to speak. Education is huge, of course, making sure people really understand the science, but in a way that's clear, that's accessible.
Right.
And then there's the whole issue of access to things like genetic counseling, premarital screening, making those things readily available.
It's interesting you mentioned premarital screening because that seemed like kind of a big deal in what I was reading.
It can be huge. Imagine being able to know before you even get married what the potential risks are for your future kids.
Yeah.
That knowledge is empowering. It lets you make decisions that are right for you within your own belief system, within your own values.
That's like it threads that needle, right? It acknowledges the cultural aspect while also giving people the tools to be well informed.
Exactly. It's about giving people agency, not dictating how they should live their lives.
Which, let's be real, that's a conversation that needs to happen within those communities themselves. It's not about outsiders coming in and,
Exactly. It's about facilitating dialogue, encouraging those conversations to happen openly and honestly.
Totally. And honestly, this whole thing has been such a great reminder that sometimes the most complicated issues, they don't have simple solutions. We've talked about history, culture, family, science. It's all tangled up in this one topic.
It really is.
And if nothing else, I hope our listeners walk away with like a little more nuance, a little more empathy, because it's easy to judge from the outside.
Absolutely.
What about you? Is there one thing, one takeaway that really sticks with you after digging into all this?
For me, it's that reminder that traditions, even ones with deep roots, they can change. They can evolve. It's not this either-or situation, tradition versus progress. It's about finding that balance,
Yeah.
respecting where people are coming from while also giving them the knowledge, the choices to shape their own futures.
I love that. And it's funny because when I first started reading about this, I was kind of overwhelmed, honestly. It seemed so, I don't know, intractable.
Right.
But hearing you talk about it, it does make me feel hopeful. Well, this has been fantastic. So many things to think about. And to our listeners, we hope you found this deep dive as thought-provoking as we did. If you're interested in learning more, we've got some extra resources linked in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. Until next time, keep those questions coming and keep exploring the world with us.